Hi, I'm Chloe.
And I'm Bez.
And this podcast is for graduate teachers in their first 5 years.
We share our own teaching stories as well as advice and ideas we wish we'd had as graduate teachers.
Sometimes funny, sometimes horrifying, but always true.
We want you to thrive and love teaching beyond the dreaded 5-year cliff. Hi, I'm Bez.
And I'm Chloe.
And today's episode is going to be different to our previous episodes.
In the media recently, we've seen a bit of an uptick in the antisocial behaviour towards women, specifically in the context of schools. We understand that the tone of this podcast is probably going to be a little bit different to some of the lighter and cheerier episodes that you're used to hearing, but we think that this is an important episode for us to record. We also really want to make sure that we're providing practical support should you face any difficult situations at work.
So as young female teachers ourselves, with everything that's been happening in the media, this has really made us reflect on our own experiences in the classroom and really how they were managed or not managed, and the other types of experiences that teachers may have faced. Things like ageism, homophobia, racism, just to name a few.
If you would like to tune out at this point because you think that this might be a bit much, we understand. And we'll see you back next week for something a little lighter and a little cheerier. Otherwise, for additional support, please make sure that you access resources such as Beyond Blue at 1300 224 636, Lifeline on 131114, and you can also get domestic violence support by calling 1-800-RESPECT.
So while we acknowledge, there's a range of different types of prejudices and discrimination that people may experience, today on the podcast in particular, we'll be casting our focus towards women and providing practical tips on how to manage these difficult situations and, what we might have done differently.
Yeah, and speaking to our own experiences. So starting there, Bez, what types of experiences have you had in the classroom? And again, only share what you feel comfortable sharing.
Yeah, great question. With everything that's been happening in the media, reflecting on my own personal experience, there has been a range of inappropriate or events that have made me uncomfortable that I probably also didn't realise at the time as well, which I think is probably important to note. So,
without speaking specifically to certain events, can you just give a bit of a summary about when we talk about behaviours that we weren't okay with, in general, what do you mean by that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. So when I first started teaching, I was quite a young female teacher. There were a lot of comments made about my body from students. There were sexual innuendos. There were comments made about dating, after a student had finished high school as well.
Yep.
And it wasn't just comments or, verbal things. There was also physical intimidation as well. But mainly just when I look back, mainly a lot of comments about my physical body and sort of innuendos.
And how did that make you feel?
Uncomfortable, but at the time, I was quite young.
Yeah.
And when I don't know how to deal with things, I will just laugh.
Yeah.
So in hindsight now, I can reflect more on my emotions at the time. And it's very uncomfortable.
But your reaction at the time might have been to laugh it off.
Yes.
Whilst you processed it.
Yeah. Yeah. How about yours? What's your experience?
Pretty similar experience to you. I was also pretty fresh out of uni. I was probably a little bit older than you because I think I spent too much time studying at uni. But that's a different story. But yeah, I think I experienced some similar things. So young boys in the classroom making comments about my appearance, what I was wearing sometimes, about different parts of my body, boys that you would hear that might have crushes on you and make comments about wanting to date you. But then also other types of antisocial behaviours from students that I didn't know in the yard. So we'd have groups of boys whilst you're on yard duty who might surround you or block entrances to doorways because they knew that you couldn't push past them because they know that teachers can't touch students. And so they'd physically intimidate you, and that was pretty confronting because I like in those moments I felt pretty helpless. And I didn't feel safe. Like I felt like, okay, these students are deliberately trying to make me feel uncomfortable here, and I don't feel like there's anything that I can do about it in this moment. And that was quite a lot to sit with.
I can imagine.
And I would say even into my career as a teacher, those were still behaviours that continued.
Wow.
And they didn't necessarily go away. I mean, we could also bring it down to even just noticing the differences in how young men would respond to male teachers versus female teachers and the level of authority that people had, and, you know, just the ways that these young boys would behave when they had a male teacher in front of them versus me or someone else. And it definitely made me feel like I wasn't respected.
And takes away from your experience and that lack of compliance, even though you're the one that's speaking to them or who has the experience as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I had a similar experience actually as a wellbeing coordinator. I couldn't tell you the amount of times I would sit in a room and I'd requested that meeting and I was the wellbeing coordinator.
Yep.
And there was a classroom teacher in there, and I've had cases of students, I've had cases of their parents as well, just not looking at me when I'm talking to them.
Yeah.
But then addressing the classroom teacher. It's just, that lack of compliance.
Yeah, or feeling ignored.
And respect as well, yeah.
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
I think that is a really nice time for us to transition into considering, okay, how have some of these situations, how have we dealt with these? How have we been supported with some of the consequences of these behaviours? Or how have we maybe not been supported? What do we think needs to happen in order for this to be addressed properly in schools? Because we know that these behaviours exist. We know that sometimes they are behaviours that come from their personal lives, whether that's at home or whether that's from content that they're consuming online, whether that's from their friends. It comes from somewhere. It doesn't just get born out of nothing. It is generally like these are learned behaviours. And if that culture is then perpetuated amongst these young groups of boys that do congregate, that do talk, and that do then accept these behaviours and perpetuate them with one another, that they're going to continue. So I think the key to stopping this from occurring and making sure that young female teachers such as ourselves, and even older female teachers who've been in the game for a long time and are still facing the same issues, are supported and respected and feel safe in their own workplaces. Like, yeah, we need to figure out, okay, well, where are we going wrong? How do we address this properly?
Yeah. And at the end of the day, everyone has a right to feel safe at the workplace, regardless of who they are.
Yep.
At the end of the day, it's that person needs to feel safe at their workplace.
And it's weird, isn't it? Like, schools are interesting spaces in that as teachers, we are so used to putting our students first, and their safety and their well-being is often at the front of our minds, that sometimes it really is easy to forget that, hey, this is also a workplace, and would this behaviour be accepted in other types of workplaces? Probably not.
No. You'd hope not.
You would absolutely hope not. Are you happy to speak to any of like your own personal examples or examples of things that you've heard from people you know?
From my previous experience, what I found really helpful is having a go-to phrase where you can call out inappropriate or unsafe behaviour or a phrase that can communicate your boundaries and that's being crossed.
Is that something you've done or you've seen other people do?
Yeah, so that was actually recommended to me from another teacher. So I would have on a Post-it note, like 3 go-to phrases, and if I felt unsafe or uncomfortable, while you're emotional or your heart is racing or you feel uncomfortable, it's quite hard to be able to articulate yourself clearly.
Yeah.
So I found having those statements written down and visible, I was able to call out that behaviour and communicate that my boundaries were being crossed. So something like, this behaviour is not okay, I'm going to ask you to stop, and this is the first time I'm asking you, I'd like you to stop.
Yep.
I found that helpful. And for the most part, the behaviour did stop. But I found having statements like, okay, this is now the second time that I'm asking you to stop. If this behaviour continues, then X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's the next step to that? Like, say I am a student in your class and I've said something that's made you feel uncomfortable. You've asked me to stop and I've stopped. Does it end there or is there a next step?
No, absolutely not. It does not end there. I'd continue the class, but then I would actually ask the student to stay behind and have a conversation about that. Yep. It also depends on if you feel comfortable enough to have that conversation with the student. If you don't, you can reach out to the wellbeing coordinator, and it's always helpful having someone facilitate that conversation.
Yeah. Who would you get to facilitate that?
One of the wellbeing coordinators or that student's wellbeing coordinator. I think it's really important to have restorative conversations.
Yeah.
Sometimes students, and it's not an excuse at all, sometimes students will do something to get a laugh or to be part of a social group. Obviously that's very important at that age. So I think it's really important to have that follow-up conversation so that they understand the impact and the consequences of their behaviours.
Yeah.
Because sometimes they won't recognise that or won't be able to actually think of that themselves. And like I said, it's absolutely no excuse, but I think that's the power of restorative conversations or workshops. It's something that will actually facilitate change, hopefully, in the future, where they're able to identify that what they've done has an impact and able to change their behaviours.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about your experience? Have you got an example of something that has been helpful or something that has not been helpful in these situations?
I mean, look, I completely agree with you. I think restorative practice is really important, and having those restorative conversations can be really powerful. For those who don't know, restorative practice is the act of making sure that after you try to, what would you say, discipline a behaviour, Bez? Yep, you're nodding at me, so I'm going to take that as confirmation. So after you discipline a behaviour, that you make sure that you then sit down with a student in a separate situation. Best practice actually recommends that you sit side by side with a student to show that you're on the same level, and that you then discuss the behaviour, how that behaviour impacts others, and then come to an agreement about, how you can both work together to overcome the problem moving forward. So I absolutely think that is the best way to go about it. And I have had situations where this has been done really successfully with the issues that we're discussing today. So there was one instance where I did have one of my senior students make some inappropriate comments about my personal life in class in front of some friends. That made me feel very uncomfortable. And in the moment, I was a little bit shocked. Sometimes when this happens, it completely blindsides you and you don't see it happening, and you might have a really good relationship with the student, but it happens and then you're like, oh God, okay, what do I do now? Even if you know that they didn't mean it, they still need to know, hey, this is the repercussions of what you've just done. So I shut the conversation down really quickly and I let the student know, hey, that makes me feel really uncomfortable and it's not okay. I'd like to speak to you after class. They took that seriously, which was good. And I had a quick chat with them and they were like, oh, miss, that's not what I meant. Ha ha ha. Like, oh, I didn't mean for that. Oh, just, he couldn't really explain to me why he'd said that in that moment. I think he was just trying to have a laugh with his friends. So anyway, we kind of had the conversation ended there, but I didn't feel completely at peace with it yet. And I didn't know whether or not that was going to have a big enough impact on this student. And I still felt a bit yuck about it. I'm going to be honest. So what I did then is I actually went and spoke to this student's coordinator, who was a more senior member of staff, and she was female. I feel like that's actually important to note because as much as I hate to say it, sometimes my experience in speaking to male staff about this, I've gotten very different responses, which makes me upset, but we can go into that separately. And she took it really seriously. She was like, oh my gosh, that's absolutely disgraceful. I'm going to call his father and let his father know what he said. I know he's going to be really disappointed. I'm going to bring him into my office and have a really stern talking to him. Do you feel comfortable also coming in so that we can have another restorative discussion? And I said to her, yep, I'm completely comfortable with that. So that's what we did. She'd had a really stern talking to him. So by the time I'd walked into the room, I could see that he was pretty upset, rightly so. And we sat down, we had a chat, and he apologised to me. And I thanked him for his apology and just reiterated that, hey, that made me feel very uncomfortable. And I set a boundary. So similar to how you did before, Bez, when you were like, I think it's really important that you set your boundaries in those instances. I just said to him, I'd really appreciate if you gave me some space for a little while, and I would not like to be around you and your friends in class, like, alone. And he was like, okay. So we had the discussion. We left the room, the conference room, and as we exited, he stopped me again and said, just so you know, miss, I actually am really sorry. So at that point, I was like, okay, this actually has sunk in. This means something to you. You realise the impact of this, how it's made me feel as a female member of staff, how it's made me feel as your teacher, how it's made me feel as a woman. And he got it. And the good thing was I taught him the next year in his final year of school and had a fantastic relationship with him, and he was completely respectful. On the flip side, it doesn't always go that way.
No.
So have you heard of, I like, personal examples might not be the best way to go here, but can you think of some examples, or are you willing to share any examples of, okay, things actually haven't gone right in this instance? What might be done differently?
Yeah. So like I said before, and like you had gone through that as well, that restorative conversation is so important. I think it's also important to our listeners to hear that that is not always going to work.
Yeah.
Depending on the person as well, which can feel very frustrating. I've had a couple of instances, and I won't go into detail, but where a restorative conversation was just not going to do the job, or, we would sit down and it would be like, yep. And it was very clearly...
Can I ask? Because, I have my own ideas about why sometimes restorative conversations don't work. And I do wonder sometimes if it sets up this stereotype that women are nags.
Like with a restorative conversation?
Yeah. Which I completely disagree with, obviously, because there is a something. But because they sometimes don't see an issue with their behaviour, and depending on their own personal views and values, they may not care about the consequences of them because it doesn't impact them and it doesn't impact a group of people that they respect. In some cases. And then we kind of perpetuate this stereotype that, women just complain about things, and I just need to nod and say yes and say sorry, and then I can do it again next time and it's fine. I
think somewhat, and I think there are also people where at that age, or with at who they are at that current point in time, they're unable to process or develop that sort of level of empathy. I've had cases where I've had a male wellbeing teacher try to do those restorative practices as well and have gotten the same responses
Okay.
as well. So I think
don't think it's gender-based.
yeah, I'm thinking of like a few students that I've had. So what I'm trying to say is I think there are some people where just a restorative practice, or you could try anything,
Yeah.
is not going to cut it. Like it's sort of a call out the behaviour, this is the consequence. Call out the behaviour, this is the consequence. Like you're on a very thin and narrow.
Okay.
Is that
So
a saying?
need to,
A thin and narrow line?
so we need to classically condition them.
Pretty much.
Yeah, far out.
And I think that's largely due to the way maybe they've been brought up, or, you know, who they've had as
It's their beliefs, right?
Exactly, yeah.
It can come down to their beliefs. I think this is a really good time then for us to transition into other places that some of these views, values and beliefs may come from. And we know, both in the media and from our own experience, that many of the beliefs these young men buy into do come from this rise of what I would describe as misogynistic male influences.
Have you got something in mind, Chloe?
Well, firstly, do you agree?
Yes, absolutely. I think social media and students' environments have a very large contributing factor to their beliefs and their behaviours, and that clearly comes out in the behaviour.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know I was reading an article recently about some boys in a high school that would make jokes to female teachers and say things like, make me a sandwich, which they thought was very funny. But it does, I mean, obviously, yeah, it's a misogynistic phrase in general, but is something that a particular, I will say, male influencer, not that I think they should hold much influence, but unfortunately they do, says a lot in their content. My personal experience with this has been quite similar, to the point where young boys would directly target young female teachers and ask them, oh, what's your opinion on this person? Just to get a reaction out of people and make these teachers feel really uncomfortable.
Yeah, like fishing.
Fishing, yeah. They're kind of, they're waiting for that reaction. They want to antagonize you. They want to show that they hold power over you and upset you, which is, I mean, in any other workplace, that would be called bullying.
Yeah.
How one of the schools I worked at the time actually tackled this was to ban students from speaking about this influencer, which I both understood but was also very confused by. Because I don't believe that, like, female staff weren't consulted on the decision.
Yeah.
I know I wasn't consulted, or any of my young female colleagues, we weren't consulted about what an appropriate response might be. And then we had a number of young boys who were just really curious and not at all antagonistic or buying into these beliefs, but were honestly just confused about, like, okay, why has this been banned? Why can't we talk about this? I don't understand. And I saw that as a really, like, an absolutely missed learning opportunity.
Yeah.
Because ignoring the behaviour and ignoring these views and these values does not fix them.
No. If anything, it makes it worse.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I was a little bit cheeky and I broke the rules. But I did have a Year 9 student who just kept asking me, like, I don't understand why it's been banned. I keep getting in trouble because I'm asking about this. And he said to me, Miss, I'm just genuinely curious and I don't understand. Can you tell me? And I totally get where he was coming from. And at the time, I was teaching a class of Year 9. So there was a bunch of Year 9 boys in this class who were also listening in on this discussion. So I was like, okay, this is a really good learning opportunity. So I turned to him and I said, okay, I'll have this conversation with you as long as we can all promise that we are going to be respectful of one another and make sure that everybody feels safe. Can we do that? And they all agreed. And he was like, yes, miss, absolutely. And so I just explained, I said, you know, this person who we're not really allowed to talk about anymore has some views and some values and some ideas that they spread about women online that is quite hurtful and can make people really uncomfortable, and it makes them feel like they're not respected, and it also makes them feel like they're not safe. And I said, what you need to remember is that there are many females that make up our school community, both your classmates, but also your teachers. And I said, whilst this is your school, I said, you also need to remember that this is our workplace. You not only have a right, and your peers not only have a right to feel safe and respected when they come here, but so do we, as this is also our workplace. I said, so can you understand why, we're trying to make sure that students aren't bringing this up and making people feel uncomfortable? And he was like, yeah, miss, that makes complete sense. Thank you for explaining that to me. And that was it. End of conversation. And I was like, why aren't we having this conversation with a bunch of other boys?
Yeah.
Because sometimes, I think particularly young students, I don't know if you've had this, Bez, but they forget that we're human.
Yes, absolutely. And I think actually when you say that statement, I think as a teacher, like you had said it before, Chloe, that we're so used to being thoughtful and thinking of our students and their needs and that they're safe and all that. I also think, of course, depending on the behaviour and the time and the place, there are moments, and definitely in my experience, there are times where I've actually shown that I'm actually really angry or I'm really upset, and I've explicitly said that. And I think that is powerful, so that students remember as well that as teachers, we are also still human.
Yep.
We're not some sort of machine with no emotions, who can't be hurt by anything. So I also think there are instances where students do have to hear how hurt or angry or upset so that they can understand the consequences of their actions. Yeah.
The implications, the consequences, and then I think there needs to be in-school consequences.
Absolutely. And that's where, also, if you need support, asking for other teachers to support you in terms of following up or how to manage a situation, because there's a lot of people who've had a lot of experience, unfortunately.
It's so important to speak to somebody that you trust and that will take you seriously.
Yeah, absolutely.
And look, I know I said earlier that I've had instances where there have been some male colleagues of mine who perhaps haven't taken some of the things I've said very seriously, or, it can get, fobbed off as a bit of like, oh, boys will be boys, or I'll have a chat to them. And I've felt like, well, no, I don't think a chat is I don't think that's an appropriate reaction. I think that there needs to be further consequences to this. Whereas female staff members have had completely different reactions to it and have taken things more seriously. On the flip side, I'm definitely not blanketing or putting all male colleagues that I've had into one bucket. I've got others that are completely supportive and have been fantastic allies. But I think we need a consistent approach to how these behaviours are handled. If we're going to deal with this issue, which we're seeing across the country, not just in our own experiences. I mean, we were having a very informal chat the other day, and nearly every single female teacher that we know has experienced this in some way, shape or form. And one of our male colleagues here at Ed Roller was listening into us, and he was a bit shocked. He was like, I can't believe it's that widespread. And we were kind of like, oh, yeah, it's kind of just what happens. But, it shouldn't be.
Of course, it shouldn't be the norm.
Yeah.
What's that called? The
inverted talking
air
marks.
commas.
Yeah.
One thing as well I think that's important to note is, looking back now, I'm a sort of person where sometimes it takes me a bit of time to actually process a situation or my emotions and how I actually feel. And particularly if it's a situation where you might feel unsafe or threatened or anything like that, I just want to put it out there as well that it is okay if, for example, something has happened and you've taken a day or 2 days or, even a week and go, oh, wow, I'm actually not okay with this.
Yeah.
Just know that you can also still follow up on that behaviour and have those conversations when you have processed that situation and your emotions. Don't feel like just because you didn't call it out or you haven't had that conversation immediately that it means that the ship has sailed. Yeah, you have a right to feel safe. So
Completely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've definitely had moments where like something's been said and then a week later I've been like, oh, actually, I don't think that was okay and I don't feel okay about that. And I've gone and spoken to someone about it.
Yeah.
And like do it. Do it because it sends the right message to students and it also makes sure that you're feeling okay, keeps everyone in your school community knowledgeable about what's actually going on, if there are any common threads in what's happening.
Yeah.
And it's so important. So I suppose some of the things that we've talked about is things that are unhelpful. Not having allies, not having consequences, not having consistent responses to things. Censorship can be unhelpful depending on the situation, whereas things that can be really helpful is making sure that you've got someone in your corner that you feel comfortable speaking to, not letting things slide by or feeling like you've let them go too long. Speak up.
Yep. Communicate your boundaries.
Yeah,
Call
boundaries.
out behaviour. Calling out behaviour. I think that's just it. Calling out is so important.
And knowing that you don't have to do anything that you don't feel comfortable doing.
Yes, absolutely.
Don't do something that you wouldn't do in another job. Although that's a weird question to ask in teaching.
I guess like on top of all those, we've gone through things that have been helpful, things that have not been helpful. Reflecting on your previous experience now, like in hindsight, what advice or what things did you wish you knew then?
Yeah. So like hindsight advice? Okay. I would really want to make sure that I understood that I didn't have to put up with behaviour. And there are certain things that I think in the moment I probably felt so uncomfortable or, when you feel like you have all eyes on you and you feel a little bit like a deer in headlights.
Yes.
I've had moments like that where maybe I haven't reacted in the moment in the way that I think I should have. And so I kind of have felt like, oh, the ship has sailed. I've missed my opportunity to make this right.
Yeah.
I think I'd go back and tell myself, no, you haven't missed the opportunity. Like the opportunity's still there. And maybe you just need to speak to somebody in your school community that can support you in making sure that the right thing is done next.
Yeah. And that's so important, leaning on someone that you trust and you feel safe with, who can back you and support you.
Yeah. And if, I knew that I was going to go into a situation where I wasn't supported, like I know you've referenced difficult conversations that might involve, other stakeholders like parents, staff members, whoever it is, making sure that, you can ask somebody who you do trust, who is going to be an advocate to come along with you to those discussions and to those interactions.
Yeah.
And they can also be there as a witness.
Yes.
Which is super important.
I think that's really important. Even if you feel the slightest uncomfortable or that gut feeling that you have before walking into a meeting, it's better to have someone there than not there, because if things escalate or if anything happens, it feels better knowing that there's also someone there to help de-escalate.
Yep.
Yeah.
What would your hindsight advice be to young Bez?
My advice would be, I think like the calling out of that behaviour is really important, and the following up on it, but also documenting the conversations and the incidents. So, at your school you'll have some sort of LMS, where you can document.
System.
Yeah, where you can follow up on behaviours or phone calls or emails and all that. I think having it all documented, like if you've had that conversation with a student or with their parent, or you've had a phone call, putting it down, and it's not just something bad is going to happen down the track, but it's also really important to have that documentation should anything happen. If you wanted to escalate the situation further, that's my thing.
Yeah.
The other thing as well in hindsight is if you feel like you've raised a concern or a situation and you felt like it wasn't handled adequately, and, like you've mentioned that to someone and that hasn't been taken seriously, have a look at the school's whistleblower policy, and I would escalate that. Go with your gut if you felt like things haven't been resolved, if you still feel uncomfortable or unsafe and you've expressed that concern to your school community and that hasn't been followed up, then, there's the whistleblower policy where you're able to follow up on that to someone externally and they will take a look into that.
Absolutely. Well. And I'm going to actually not finish, but the last piece of advice that I'd give, and this is actually coming from something that you said, Bez, and that was that, and it follows on from that whistleblower policy that you just mentioned, is making sure that you do speak to someone, that you do feel heard, whether you go ahead with the whistleblower policy or whether you do need to then go and seek counselling or whatever it is that you need, making sure that you deal with your own emotions and not hold them in.
Yes. Because
if you do, then you can develop other feelings that are really not nice to have, like shame and anger and fear. And they're not really nice things to feel on a consistent basis or when you just have to go to work and do your job.
Yeah, I really love that. And sometimes you don't deal with those emotions or communicate or talk to someone you trust about them, your head can take those emotions in very funny directions. So absolutely. I think that's an excellent point.
The last thing that I am going to add in here before we wrap up for today, and I know this was a very different tone to what we're used to doing, if you are in school leadership, I would implore you to look at how your own school deals with issues such as this and what processes and procedures and expectations and training you have for your staff even. What are the things that you have in place to support the well-being of your staff, your female staff in particular, and therefore your female students and the relationships that young men will then go on to have with females in the real world. It might be something as simple as reviewing a dress code. I don't know, that's something we spoke about. It could come down to programs that you run within school or the language that you use. It could be uniforms. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But I think it's worth looking at. It's worth investigating. It's worth talking about.
Yeah.
Lastly, if you need any additional support after listening today, you can contact Beyond Blue at 1300 224 636.
Or domestic violence support, 1-800-RESPECT.
Or Lifeline on 131114.
And we'll link all of those in the show notes. But thank you for joining us for a bit of a different yet still professional episode. We hope that it is helpful given the current situation in the media. And we'll see you next week.
We'll see you next week, yeah. And I guess, we hope you don't experience this.
Yes.
Or you're fortunate enough not to.
Yes.
Catch you next week.
Bye.
Bye.